plan had always been to be while they were alive, was, so the blood would coagulate and I could get all the blood out. And when I whacked her with that, and she's like, oh, and started crying, and she's like, oh God, I'm sorry. After I hit her a couple times, I finally just had to, jump up and grab her, and I didn't want to choke her, because like I said, I wanted the body to be pretty much perfect. So I didn't want to leave the, marks around her neck, because with my plan to eat her and everything.
December 19, 2024. It was a cold winter morning in McAlester, Oklahoma. Behind the walls of the state penitentiary, witnesses gathered for what would become the final execution of the year. On a gurney lay Kevin Ray Underwood, a man whose name had haunted headlines for nearly 2 decades. At 10:12 a.m., on his 45th birthday, the warden gave the signal. Within minutes, Underwood's chest fell still, and his life ended by lethal injection. But who was this man, and why did his story disturb an entire nation? To understand that, we have to go back to 2006. A quiet town, a missing child, and a confession so grotesque that detectives themselves struggled to believe what they were hearing. This wasn't just murder. It was a crime born from a cannibalistic fantasy, a detailed plan to kill, to mutilate, and even consume a 10-year-old girl. For 18 years, Underwood waited on death row, fighting appeals, writing letters, and spending every waking moment under the shadow of his own horrific crime. Tonight, we're diving into the full story, from the chilling crime scene, to the tense trial, to his last meal and his final words. This is the case of Kevin Ray Underwood, the so-called cannibal killer, whose execution on his birthday still raises the question, can true justice ever be served when the crime itself is beyond comprehension? Jamie Rose Boland was simply a little girl living a small-town life. She was 10 years old, with bright red hair that caught the sunlight and freckles scattered across her cheeks. Family called her Coppertop, a nickname that stuck because of her fiery hair and even brighter personality. Jamie was playful, curious, and at that tender age where the world still feels like a safe place. She lived with her father, Curtis Boland, in a modest apartment in Purcell. Curtis was doing his best as a single dad, balancing work and raising a daughter he adored. Jamie's mother, Jennifer Fox, was still part of her life, and between the two households, she had the kind of childhood most people in a small Oklahoma town would recognize: school days, library visits, afternoons riding her bike, evenings filled with cartoons and the comfort of family. April 12, 2006 began like any other Wednesday. Jamie went about her day, cheerful and full of energy. She stopped by the local library, a place she loved, before heading back home to the apartment complex she shared with her dad. Curtis was working late that evening, something not unusual, and Jamie knew the short walk home well. It was the kind of everyday routine that never felt dangerous, until that day. When night came and Jamie hadn't returned as expected, the unease began. Curtis called around. Neighbors hadn't seen her. By late that night, Jamie was officially reported missing. Volunteers and police quickly mobilized. The next morning, flyers with her face appeared on telephone poles. By the second day, the search had grown larger, with state police and the FBI joining in. But still, no Jamie. Jamie's final walk home had taken her right past a neighbor's apartment, and inside lived a man with a secret so horrifying, it would shake the entire nation once it came to light. In the same apartment complex where Jamie lived, was a man whose private world was darker than anyone could have imagined. His name was Kevin Ray Underwood, 26 years old, awkward, quiet, a factory worker who mostly kept to himself. To neighbors, he was just the shy guy upstairs who played video games and surfed the internet. But inside his head, Underwood lived with fantasies that were chilling, violent, and meticulously planned. For months, he had written about them in private journals, fantasies of luring a child, killing them, dismembering the body, and even consuming it. He had already bought the tools he thought he would need: knives, skewers, a meat tenderizer, even a bottle of barbecue sauce. And on April 12, 2006, when Jamie walked past his door, Underwood saw his chance to finally act out what he had only imagined. He coaxed Jamie into his apartment with something every 10-year-old would find harmless: a pet rat. But once the door closed, the mask of a friendly neighbor disappeared. He struck Jamie on the head with a wooden cutting board. As she struggled, he smothered her with duct tape, and finally pressed his hand over her mouth and nose until she could no longer breathe. In his later confession, Underwood admitted she fought hard, but in the end, she was no match for him. With Jamie's lifeless body in the bathtub, Underwood tried to carry out the rest of his fantasy. He used a knife and a saw to attempt to decapitate her, intending to keep parts of her body in his refrigerator. His plan, as grotesque as it sounds, was to season and cook her remains. But he didn't go through with it. Instead, he placed her body into a large plastic storage tub, sealed it with duct tape, and hid it in his bedroom closet. To mislead investigators, he dismantled Jamie's purple bicycle and stashed it, hoping it would look like she had ridden away and vanished on her own. But the truth was contained within the four walls of his apartment, a secret waiting to be uncovered. And when police finally began asking questions in those crucial days after Jamie disappeared, Ray Underwood's carefully constructed mask of normality started to crack. After Jamie's disappearance, detectives widened their focus to the apartment complex where she lived. They went door to door, questioning neighbors, listening for any detail that might explain how a 10-year-old girl could vanish in broad daylight. Most residents gave simple, straightforward answers. But when investigators knocked on the door of 26-year-old Ray Underwood, something immediately stood out. He invited them in, answered quickly, but there was something off in his tone, detached, almost rehearsed. He volunteered strange details no one had asked for, mentioning his pet rat, rambling about cartoons, and giving a timeline that felt inconsistent. To seasoned detectives, it was a red flag. His name was circled for a second, deeper interview. Back at the station, Underwood agreed to speak again. What followed unsettled investigators even more. His answers wandered, full of nervous tangents, and when asked directly about Jamie, he avoided eye contact. Detectives asked for permission to search his apartment. To their surprise, Underwood didn't hesitate. He signed the form and let them in. At first glance, the rooms looked ordinary: a small kitchen, cluttered living room, bedroom with stacks of books and DVDs. But then, in the closet, officers found a large plastic storage tub. It was sealed tightly with duct tape. They cut it open. Inside, they found Jamie. The two-day search ended in an instant, and what was once hope for a safe return turned into confirmation of a nightmare. When confronted, Underwood didn't deny it. He simply said, "Go ahead and arrest me. She's in there. I hit her and chopped her up." In that moment, the mask dropped completely. Detectives documented every detail of the scene: the tools, the duct tape, the disassembled pieces of Jamie's purple bicycle that he had tried to hide. Forensic teams pulled journals and computer records that laid out his violent fantasies in chilling, premeditated detail. The investigation was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Ray Underwood had confessed, the evidence surrounded him, and the town of Purcell would never again look at the quiet man in the upstairs apartment as just another neighbor. He was now a killer. The case against Ray Underwood moved quickly. With a full confession, a body recovered from his apartment, and evidence that left little room for doubt, prosecutors prepared for one of the most harrowing trials in Oklahoma's history. In 2008, 2 years after Jamie's murder, the courtroom in Purcell filled with reporters, family members, and townspeople who wanted to hear how justice would be delivered. The jury was seated, 12 men and women who would be asked to relive, in graphic detail, the final hours of a 10-year-old girl. From the very first day, it was clear this would not be a trial about whether Ray Underwood had committed the crime. He had already admitted it. The question was what to do with him: life in prison, or death. The prosecution opened by laying out a timeline that was as devastating as it was precise. They showed jurors the journals Underwood had written, pages filled with fantasies of killing, mutilating, and consuming human flesh. They displayed the tools found in his apartment. They spoke of how Jamie was lured, attacked, suffocated, and then stuffed into a storage tub as if her life had been nothing more than a discarded possession. Underwood's defense team, realizing they could not argue innocence, tried instead to argue mitigation. They painted a picture of a troubled man, someone living with autism, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and schizotypal personality disorder. They called psychiatrists to the stand, hoping to show that his mind was broken, that his crime was the act of someone who was not fully in control of his own impulses. But for the jury, the question wasn't whether Underwood was disturbed. It was whether his disturbance excused the deliberate, step-by-step way he carried out Jamie's murder. Prosecutors reminded them of his methodical planning, the journals, the shopping lists, the tools, the cleanup attempt. This wasn't a sudden act of madness, it was a plan brought to life. After weeks of testimony, the prosecution said simply, this was evil, pure and calculated. And the only just punishment is death. When the jury retired to deliberate, hours later, the verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, death. As the judge read the sentence aloud, Jamie's family held each other tightly. For them, nothing could bring her back. But for the first time since April of 2006, there was a sense that some measure of justice had been delivered. Kevin Ray Underwood was formally condemned to die. For many killers, a death sentence is the end of their story. But in America, the years that follow on death row can stretch into decades, a waiting game measured in appeals, petitions, and the slow march of time. For Kevin Ray Underwood, that waiting lasted nearly 18 years. He was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, a maximum security facility that houses the state's most dangerous inmates. Behind those walls, Underwood became inmate number 6253, confined to a tiny cell, his days reduced to the monotonous rhythm of prison life. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, not a troublemaker. He read, he wrote, and he kept largely to himself. But the darkness of his crime was never far away. His defense attorneys filed appeal after appeal, arguing that his execution should be blocked because of his long history of mental illness. Reports highlighted diagnoses of autism, bipolar disorder, PTSD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. They argued that executing a man with such conditions was cruel, that he needed treatment, not a needle in the arm. But prosecutors countered with the evidence, the deliberate journals, the shopping list of tools, the calculated way he lured Jamie. Time and again, courts upheld the original sentence. In 2023, with his execution date looming, Underwood's legal team made one final push before the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board. They begged for clemency, pointing to his psychiatric struggles and the fact that he had expressed remorse. But the board voted against him. By the end of that hearing, it was clear, his fate was sealed. And so the years of waiting narrowed down to weeks, then days, then hours. His execution date was set, December 19, 2024. His 45th birthday. The final execution in the United States that year. Underwood was woken early, his cell cleared of personal items, and he was given the choice of a shower, a shave, and a fresh prison uniform. Visits were allowed in those hours. A prison chaplain offered prayers. For his family, the burden was unbearable. Outside the prison walls, news crews gathered in the cold air, cameras trained on the gates. Inside, the victim's family was escorted to a waiting area, preparing for the moment they had waited nearly 2 decades to witness. By midday, Underwood was moved to the holding cell adjacent to the death chamber. He was allowed phone calls, and he used some of them to tell his family he was sorry, that he wished things could have been different. As the clock ticked toward the appointed hour, prison officials carried out one of the rituals every execution brings, the final meal. His tray arrived heavy with food, chicken fried steak, a cheeseburger with fries and ketchup, a serving of pinto beans, a hot roll, mashed potatoes, and a cola to wash it all down. For a man who had spent years writing fantasies about flesh and cannibalism, his last choice was oddly ordinary, almost painfully human. Minutes later, he was escorted into the execution chamber. The witnesses, family of the victim, members of his own family, journalists, state officials, watched as he was strapped to the gurney, for lines were inserted into his arms. The room fell silent, waiting for his last statement. Underwood's voice was steady but tinged with sorrow. The decision to execute me on my birthday and 6 days before Christmas was needlessly cruel to my family, he said. But I'm very sorry for what I did, and I wish I could take it back. He turned his words toward the Boland family, offering an apology, knowing nothing he could say would heal the wound he created. He then spoke softly about his own family, his regret that his choices had destroyed their lives too. Those words hung heavy in the air. For Jamie's family, it wasn't enough, nothing ever could be, but it was the closest thing to remorse they had heard from the man who took their daughter. At exactly 10:12 a.m., the warden gave the signal. The lethal injection began to flow. Witnesses described Kevin's chest rising and falling a few times, then stilling. After nearly 18 years of waiting, the sentence had been carried out. Kevin Ray Underwood, the so-called cannibal killer, was gone. Jamie's sister, Lori Pate, whispered through tears, "This doesn't bring our Jamie back, but it allows us to focus on her, and maybe begin to heal." For the Boland family, the nightmare that began in 2006 had finally reached its legal end. At exactly 10:12 a.m., the physician in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary's death chamber pronounced Kevin Ray Underwood dead. By mid-morning, the case was already making headlines across the country. Oklahoma executes cannibal killer, executed on his birthday, final U.S. execution of 2024. Kevin Ray Underwood's story was over. On April 12, 2006, Jamie Rose Boland walked past her neighbor's door, and never came home. 18 years later, on December 19, 2024, that neighbor, Kevin Ray Underwood, took his last breath strapped to a gurney. But the question remains, does death row truly deliver justice? Or does it simply add another body to the count, leaving families to wrestle with pain that never really fades? What do you think? Should mental illness play a role in sentencing? Was execution the only answer here, or should life behind bars have been enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. And if you found this story as chilling and heartbreaking as I did, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and share this video with others who follow true crime. More death row stories, more final words, and more questions that haunt our justice system are coming your way. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, behind every case, there is a victim whose story must never be forgotten.